Hi, I'm Una. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to talk about my reading in January 2025. I kind of skipped my December recap, but I don't really feel like doing it. I feel like with my end of year recap and some of the vlogs I did in December, there's a pretty good idea of what I was reading, and I'm just gonna leave it at that. So let's get into January. So January was a bit of a busier month for me. I was kind of back to work. I decided to apply to graduate school and just all that sort of stuff. And also kind of enacting my yearly goal to read a little less, linger a little more in the books I do read, and do a little more in some of my other hobbies. I did read quite a bit less than I did in any month last year. So in January, I read 14 books, around 3,000 pages, and around 30 hours of audiobooks. That is, I think my lowest month last year was 19 books. So I'm proud of myself for sticking to that and not pressuring myself to read too much. Overall, I'd say this month was a good amount of rereads, a good amount of books I'd been kind of putting off that I was reading friend recommendations, and then some amount of cozy reads and some amount of like kind of book club reads. Overall, that's the vibes. I read a little bit shorter than usual. I read 6 books under 300 pages, physically 5 over 300 pages, 1 audiobook that was under, it was like 3 hours or something, very, very short, and 2 that were longer. I read mostly fiction. My top genres were literary, classics, romance, fantasy, and mystery. So some of the general favorites, fantasy, romance, mystery, those usually pop up in my top genres, but classics and literary do not. So that's what I mean when I was kind of, I don't know, reading a little bit more of things I might otherwise put off. I did DNF 2 books. 2 books were rereads, and I chose not to rate 4 books. This is another thing that I'm trying to do more this year, is just like let myself have complicated feelings or not force myself to worry about what rating I will pick. I read 7 books physically, listened to 4 as audiobooks, 1 physical and audio, and 4 ebooks, which is pretty high actually. I had a good mix of sources. The highest was 7 from Libby, 5 from the library, 2 that I owned, 1 that I bought in 2025. This was for a book club. It was really hard to get my hands on this book, so I ended up buying the ebook, and then 1 from Hoopla and 1 I borrowed from a friend. 12 of the 14 written by women. As usual, 1 was written by multiple women, so that's more like 13. 1 was written by a man, that's pretty classic for me, and 1 was written by multiple men. And then 1 was not specified. So one kind of funny mini theme that happened this month was I did read 2 books that were translations of like ancient texts. So I read a book that was kind of an anthology of different writings from Seneca, who was a Roman politician and writer in the 1st century of the Common Era. I did count it in terms of my publication stats as the year that the book was published rather than the writings themselves, because they were from a couple of different years. It was called How to Die, and it was all about kind of planning for death and dealing with death, and that's a book that my friend recommended me. And then I also ended up reading a translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I think I also counted as the year that was translated and published rather than the year it was written. 1, because it was written in like 1200 BCE, which just messes with my stats in many ways. But 2, because it was a very interpretive translation. It was not directly translated by the translator, and a lot of the book was actually summary and analysis. So yeah, it wasn't necessarily my favorite, but I thought it was kind of funny. I don't often read ancient translated works in their entirety, so it was kind of funny that 2 of my books in January ended up being that. But yeah, I ended up actually reading 5 books from 2024, and if some of these stats don't make sense, I can't tell if these are counting my DNFs or not. So 5 from 2024, 2 from 2022 to 2023, 4 from 2020 to 2021, 3 from 2015 to 2019, and 1 from the 2000s. And then 1 from the 19th century. You know how that goes. That was The Raven, the poem. I'd say highlights from this month were The Road to Roswell, which I read for a book club, and I really, really enjoyed it. One of my like little micro tropes or plot elements that just really works for me is kidnapping, like lighthearted kidnapping. And when the kidnappee starts to side with the kidnapper, like Stockholm syndrome, but like in a lighthearted way, which The Road to Roswell has a lot of. And I thought it was really fun, and definitely not a perfect book, but I really enjoyed it. I read a couple more books I read for book clubs were Colored Television by Danzy Senna, which was kind of a lit fic woman in her 40s making bad decisions book, which I did enjoy too, and it was fun to go to the discussion. I read Milk Fed, which is another literary book. This is more a woman in her 20s or early 30s going through stuff, and that was recommended by a friend, so I'm really glad I finally read that. And then probably my two real favorites, I think the only two new 5 stars for me were Sarahland by Sam Cohen. This is a short story collection dealing with issues of growing up, adolescence, kind of girlhood and womanhood, and particularly looking at narratives and kind of how narratives play a role in our lives, how we conform or move away from them, how we try to force them on ourselves and other people. I just thought it was really interesting. It was really weird. I've been trying to read more weird books this year, and I did really well with this in January. Multiple of these lit fic books were weird books. I just really enjoyed it. I don't usually like think of my not that I read a ton of short story collections, but I don't think of it as like easy to give one 5 stars because I feel like I would want to love all the stories, but that didn't feel true for this. Like I just felt like I thought about them so much and I loved so many of them. I ended up giving it 5 stars anyway, even though a couple of them didn't work for me as much, but I really enjoyed it and the things it was thinking about and the characters it was portraying and the relationships it was portraying. It probably helps that it seems like Sam Cohen also went to a large Midwestern public university, which I can relate to, and I feel like I can connect a lot with books that have a little bit set there, which a couple of the stories were, and one of them was also about a horse girl. I was a little bit of a horse girl growing up, so yeah, I really enjoyed it. Just the weird queer relationships and friendships and everything in it was so, it just really hit me. So yeah, that one I borrowed from a friend, so thank you. Grayson from Grayson's Bookmark. She's also a YouTuber. She told me I should read it and I did, and it was great. My other new 5 star was The Five by Hallie Rubenhold. I talked about this in my Hanukkah vlog, but I didn't end up finishing it in that vlog. But this is a really incredible work of history writing, and it is definitely for a popular audience, but it's not like simplified or dumbed down in any way. It's just this really thorough look into the lives of the 5 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper, and it doesn't really talk about the killings themselves, only in referring to a little bit towards the end how the victims have been treated by like true crime fans and the public, and often a little bit about the testimony from the coroner inquests into their deaths, I think it was, that got us a lot of the information that has been preserved in the historical record about them. But it was just so impressive how much detail she was able to put together, even about the last victim, which very little was known about. The variety of like the things that were similar but also different across all these women's lives. I mean, obviously they all ended up in a very similar location, often in a very similar position of sleeping on the street because they didn't have money, employment, support, became estranged from their families. And just I still think so much about just what a loving kind of portrait it was of painting these women's lives, what they did, where they came from, the issues they had, the struggles they ran into, their relationships with their families, which were really complicated, and the kind of cultural attitudes of the time that drove them to do some of the things they did. It was just beautiful and fascinating, and I'm so glad I read it. I highly recommend it to anybody. Yeah, those are my 2, I think, top books of the month. I suppose I will leave it at that. I am filming this more than halfway through February, and I have been reading even less in February, and I've been trying to prioritize books by Black authors. I have some books that I've really enjoyed this month so far, so we'll see. Maybe I'll do a February wrap-up, maybe I'll do a February and March wrap-up, depending on how things go. But yeah, thanks for stopping by. Sorry I haven't uploaded in a while. It's been busy and I've been into other things also, and that's okay. So yeah, I'll see you when I see you next. Bye.